Two gardens on the same street, same July morning, same variety of lavender, bought the same spring from the same nursery, planted maybe 12 feet apart on either side of a fence. Both gardeners come out with shears. Both do exactly the thing every gardening video tells you to do. They find where the green growth ends and the brown wood begins, and they cut above it. Same place on the plant, same day, same cut. 3 weeks later, one of those plants is pushing fresh shoots out of nearly every stem that was touched. The other one is standing there exactly as it was left. And by September, the ends of those stems have gone dry and gray, and nothing is ever coming out of them again. Neither gardener made a mistake. Both cuts were in the green. So what happened? That question is this whole video, because the rule you have heard, cut into the green and never into the brown, is true. I am not going to argue with it, but it is only half a rule. It tells you where you are allowed to cut. It tells you nothing about whether the plant will answer you. And the thing that decides that is not in your hand. It is not in the shears. It is not even really in the stem you are holding. Stay with me for the next 20 minutes, and I will show you what actually turns a cut into new growth. It is not what almost anybody teaches, and it comes out of research that quietly overturned 100 years of textbook gardening. Once you see it, you will never look at a pair of pruners the same way again, and you will do 2 or 3 things this month that cost you absolutely nothing and change the next 10 summers of that plant. Here is the sentence I want to plant in your head, and then I will spend the next few minutes earning it. Your shears do not make new growth. Sugar makes new growth. The shears only decide where the sugar goes. Now that sounds like a clever thing to say. It is not. It comes straight out of a piece of published research, and most gardeners have never heard of it. For about a century, the story went like this. The growing tip of a shoot makes a hormone called auxin. Auxin travels down the stem, and as it goes, it holds the little buds tucked into the leaf joints below in a kind of sleep. Cut the tip off, the auxin stops, the buds wake up. That is apical dominance, and it is in every horticulture textbook I have ever read. Then in 2014, a team led by Michael Mason and Christine Beveridge at the University of Queensland published a paper in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences with a title that is almost rude in how blunt it is. Sugar demand, not auxin, is the initial regulator of apical dominance. What they found was this. When you take the tip off a plant, the buds below start growing up to a full day before the auxin level in the nearby stem has changed at all. A whole day. The hormone had not moved yet. Something else had. That something else was sugar. When the growing tip comes off, the biggest sugar customer on the plant disappears. Sugar that was heading up to feed that tip gets redistributed, and it piles into the sleeping buds. The arrival of that sugar is what lines up with the moment those buds wake. They went further. There is a gene involved, and it has a name you will remember. Branched 1. Think of it as the parking brake on a bud. While it is switched on, the bud sits still no matter what you do. When sugar rises around that bud, the gene gets switched down, and the brake comes off. So the bud does not wake up because you gave it an order with a pair of shears. It wakes up because dinner arrived. Now hold that thought and walk out to your lavender, because in July that plant is running a household budget, and there are exactly 3 places the money can go. Place 1. The spent flowers. Those faded gray spikes are not decoration, and they are not finished. Every one of them is trying to set seed, and seed is the single most expensive thing a plant does. That is a sink, and right now, it is the biggest one on the plant. Place 2. The sleeping buds down in the green, in every leaf joint below where those flower stems came from. Those buds are next year's flowering wood. They are parked with the brake on, waiting for sugar that is currently going somewhere else. Place 3, and this is the one nobody counts. Down, into the roots, and then out of the roots, into the soil itself. We are coming back to place 3, because it is the part of this video I most want you to hear. But look at what the budget already tells you. When you leave the spent flowers standing, you are not being gentle. You are signing a check, sugar keeps flowing into seed, the plant does not need, and you certainly do not want. The buds below stay asleep. The stems keep extending and hardening from the bottom up, and every season, a little more of that plant turns permanently to wood. That is where the bare knuckles come from. Not neglect. A budget decision you made by doing nothing. So why can you not simply cut down into that wood and start over? The usual answer is that lavender is strange. That is not an answer. Here is the actual one. A rose or a willow keeps a reserve. Buried under the bark of old wood, those plants maintain dormant buds that can be woken years later. Cut a rose hard and it flushes out of a cane you would have sworn was dead, because the reserve was in there the whole time. Lavender does not keep that reserve. The growth-initiating cells at the leaf joints exist only where there is still green tissue. As a stem lignifies as it turns to timber from the bottom upward, those cells are lost and not replaced, and the bark of an aging lavender stem thickens considerably, which is part of why the plant is so good at drought. But it also means that even if a bud were in there, it would have nothing to push through. Illinois Extension puts it in one flat line: do not prune below leafless wood, because regrowth will not occur. So that brown zone is not sleeping. It is a closed account. You cannot overdraw it, you cannot appeal it, and no product on any shelf reopens it. And I want to be honest about something, because this channel is honest about things. That 5-word rule, the other videos hand you, cut in the green and never in the brown, is correct. Keep it, but notice what it does and does not do for you. It keeps you from killing the plant. It does not make the plant grow. Not killing something is not the same as feeding it. Which brings us to the number everybody repeats and nobody explains. Leave 2/3 of the green on the plant. You have heard it. It gets handed over as a matter of taste, as though it were about keeping a tidy shape. It is not about shape at all. Green leaf is the factory. It is the only place on that plant where sugar gets made. So when you take green off, you are not just cutting stems, you are cutting production capacity. At the exact moment you have asked the plant for a large new construction project. Now the whole thing comes into focus, and you can see the 3 separate ways a July cut goes wrong. The first is cutting too shallow. This is the one that catches the kind, careful gardener, and nobody warns you about it. You snip the faded flower stalks off and leave everything else alone, because it looks healthy, and cutting healthy growth feels like vandalism. It looks like good gardening. Here is the problem. You removed the seed sink, yes, but you barely moved any sugar, because you barely removed any demand. Not enough of a signal to release the buds sitting low on those stems. So the plant does the one thing left to it. It grows on from the tips. And it does that again next year, and the year after. 10 years of gentle, considerate deadheading is one of the most reliable ways I know to produce a plant with bare knuckles and a hole in the middle. The kindness is the mechanism. Nobody tells you that. The second way is cutting too deep. You take so much green that the factory cannot fund the rebuild. The buds may well be released, and then they sit there with nothing to run on, and what you get is a thin, weak flush heading into autumn. And the third is cutting into the brown, which we have covered. That one is not a budget error. That is closing the account. So here is the practical version, and you can do it with your hands and no tools at all. Reach in and take a handful of stems, the way you would gather a bunch of flowers. Run your fingers down them. You will feel the stem change, from soft and leafy to stiff and barky. That boundary is your floor. Now look at how much green stands above it. You are cutting into the top third of that green and leaving 2 full thirds behind. Not 2/3 of the plant's height. 2/3 of its green. Now let me take you down to place 3, because this is the part I have been saving. When we talk about where a plant's sugar goes, we tend to draw the plant as though it stopped at the soil line. It does not. A working plant sends a serious share of everything it makes downward, and a good part of that does not stay in the roots either. It goes out through the root surface and into the ground around it. The estimates are not small. Depending on species and conditions, somewhere in the range of 5 to 21% of all the carbon a plant fixes in photosynthesis is released into the soil around its roots. That figure comes from soil scientists working on carbon flow at the root and soil interface. David Jones and colleagues, in the journal Plant and Soil. Sit with that a second. Up to 1/5 of everything the plant makes. It builds it, and then it gives it away. And not by accident. Those exudates are sugars and amino acids and organic acids. They are a payment, and what they buy is the one thing a lavender cannot do for itself. Think about where this plant is from. Thin, stony, often limey ground. In soil like that, phosphorus is usually present but locked up, bound tight where a root cannot simply take it. Lavender does not solve that with chemistry of its own. It hires help. It feeds a community around its roots, fungal partners and bacteria, and in exchange that community pries the phosphorus and trace minerals loose and hands them over at the root surface. That is the real engine of a lavender thriving on ground where you would not bother planting a carrot. Not the plant being tough, the plant paying rent. So now put the shears back in your hand. When you overcut a lavender in July, you have not only taken leaves, you have cut the income of everything living underneath that plant. In the hottest and hungriest stretch of the year, the exudate flow drops, the community around the roots contracts. And next season, in ground that was already stingy, there is less help getting phosphorus into that plant. You will see it as fewer flowers, and you will blame the winter, or the plant, or yourself. That is the actual reason this channel says feed the soil, not the plant. Most people hear that and think about compost, and compost is fine, but there is a version of it you have never been told. Your pruning shears are a soil tool. Every cut you make is a decision about what the underground gets to eat. And here is the honest part about why nobody tells you this. It is not a conspiracy. It is plain economics. Nobody can bottle restraint. There is no product called the cut you did not make. You cannot patent a handful of stems left standing, you cannot put it in a box, and you cannot ship it. So it does not get advertised. And things that do not get advertised quietly stop getting taught. All right, you know what the cut does. Now let us get you a date, and I am not going to hand you a square on a calendar, because a square on a calendar is how a gardener in Vermont and a gardener in Georgia both end up doing the wrong thing on the same weekend. You have two clocks running in July, and they pull in opposite directions. The first is the harvest clock, and it opens early. If you want those flowers for drying, for a jar on the shelf, for sachets in a drawer, take them while most of the buds on each spike are still closed and only the first few have opened, not in full glorious bloom. Full bloom is already on the way down. The color fades faster once dried, and the florets shatter off the stem the moment you handle them. The second is the ripening clock, and it closes. Whatever new growth you trigger with that cut has to have time to firm up and harden before cold weather reaches it. Soft, sappy, brand new shoots meeting a hard frost is a bad night for a plant, and it goes into winter weakened. So your date is a subtraction, and it is yours to do. Find the average first frost date for where you actually live. Count back 6 weeks. That is your closing time. Do not make a structural cut after it. And if you do not know your date, this is precisely what your county extension office exists for, and it is free. Look up your local extension service and your USDA hardiness zone before you cut anything. It takes 4 minutes, and it is the single most useful thing most gardeners never do. Now, an honest fork in the road, because for some of you, the right answer is the opposite of everything I have just said. If you garden where summers are short and frost turns up in September, do not make a structural cut now. Take the spent flower stalks off and stop there. Save the real cut for the tail end of winter, before growth starts. Forcing out growth you cannot ripen is worse than waiting. One more thing sets your date, and it is the thing most likely to be wrong on the label in your hand. You need to know which lavender you actually own, and I am going to ask you to do something slightly unfashionable. Ignore the common name and read the Latin. Here is why. The common names for lavender are a mess, and they are a mess in a way that costs people plants. The lavender with the little flags on top, the one with rabbit ears, is sold as Spanish lavender across most of the country. But you will absolutely also find it labeled French. And a different species, one with soft, toothed gray leaves, is also sold as French. Two different plants, different hardiness, different schedules, same word on the tag. So look for the Latin. It is nearly always printed in small type underneath. Lavandula angustifolia is English lavender. It is the hardy one, the classic one, the one for cooking and drying. Its main flush comes in early summer, so for a great many of you it is finishing right about now. Lavandula intermedia is the group people call lavandin. Grosso, Provence, phenomenal. These are the big long-stemmed ones. They bloom later and for longer, which means your window sits later than your neighbor's with the English. Lavandula stoechas is the rabbit ear one. It flowers early, so its moment has come and gone, and it is noticeably less cold-hardy than the first two. Lavandula dentata, the toothed one, is the tenderest of the group and does not take a vigorous cut at all. Go light, and if in doubt, take flowers only. That is not trivia. That is your calendar. And if you cannot find a Latin name anywhere and honestly cannot tell what you have, that is a perfectly good reason to do less this year and watch the plant for a season. Right. Let us actually do it. 3 days before you plan to cut, if it has been dry, give that plant one deep, slow soaking. 1. Not a routine. 1. And I want to be straight about why, because I am not going to dress up reasoning as a study. There is no trial I can point you to that tested watering lavender before pruning. This is reasoning from mechanism, and I will let you judge it. A plant short of water closes its stomata, the tiny pores on its leaves. A plant with closed stomata is not photosynthesizing much of anything. If the point of this cut is to redirect sugar, it helps if the plant is actually making some. Asking a drought-stressed lavender to fund a rebuild is asking for a loan out of an empty account. Established lavender wants dry feet as a way of life, and I stand behind that. But one deep drink before you ask it for new growth is not coddling. It is paying for the work. Then, on the day, early morning, once the dew has burned off, the oils are at their most pleasant to work with in the cool of the morning, and honestly, so are you. But I will be honest, that the claim you lose most of the fragrance by cutting at noon runs a good deal stronger than the evidence behind it. If mornings do not suit your body or your day, cut in the evening and do not lose a minute of sleep over it. The plant cares far less than the internet does. Take a bunch, not a stem. Gather a handful of flower stems in your offhand, as though collecting a posy, and cut the whole handful in one go. It is faster, far kinder to your hands and your back, and it makes a better shape than picking away stem by stem. Follow the bunch down, past the flowers, down through the leafy green, until you find a leaf joint, one of those little junctions where a pair of leaves or side shoots come off the stem. Cut just above it. What you have done there is put a released bud right at the top of that stem with a clear run at the sugar. How far down? Into the top third of the green. On the long-stemmed lavandins, you can take up to half, because so much of what you are removing is bare flower stalk rather than working leaf, and aim to finish a couple of inches above where the wood starts. 2 inches of green above the brown, minimum, on every single stem you touch. Shape as you go. You are not cutting a flat hedge top. You are working toward a rounded mound, a cushion. That shape sheds rain and snow, instead of collecting it in the crown, and a plant that stays dense in the middle is a plant that does not split open. Then stand back and check your work with your eyes, not your memory. It should still read as a green mound. If you can see bare brown sticks poking up out of the top of what you have just done, you went too far, and those sticks are not coming back. 2 small things that matter more than they sound. Use sharp bypass pruners, where the blades pass each other like scissors, not the anvil kind that crush. A crushed stem heals badly, and clean your blades between plants. 70% isopropyl alcohol works, or a fresh 10% bleach solution, which is what extension services generally recommend for tool sanitation. Rinse and dry after bleach, so you are not pitting good steel. And leave some flowers standing, not for the plant, for the bees. In a July garden, there is very little working as hard as a lavender in bloom. Take your harvest and leave them their share. So, what should you expect, and when? In a good year, on a healthy English lavender cut properly at the right moment, you may get a second, lighter flush of flowers 6 to 8 weeks after the cut. That is not a guarantee. It depends on your season, your variety, and how much summer is left where you live. Treat it as a bonus, not a promise. The first year, the honest result is that the plant looks tidier and denser, and that is mostly it. Completely normal. You are laying groundwork. The second year is where you start to see it. The mound closes up. Visibly more flowering wood, because you released buds low on the stems instead of letting the plant run on from the tips. By the third year, you have a genuinely different plant from the one your neighbor has been kindly deadheading all this time. Tighter, greener at the base, flowering right across the dome instead of only at the ends. Now, the question some of you have been shouting at the screen since minute 1. What if mine is already woody? Get down close and look for green shoots. Not green leaves up at the top, I mean tiny new growth pushing out of the old wood itself, especially low down. If you find any, you have something to work with. If a stem is completely bare and brown with no sign of anything anywhere along it, that stem is a closed account. The method that works is slow, and it is not glamorous. You take it back over 3 years, not in one afternoon. Each summer you work on a portion of the branches, taking each one back by about a third, always leaving green leaves on every branch you touch. Then again the next year, and the year after, and the plant slowly rebuilds inward toward a mound instead of sprawling outward. What you must not do is the thing everybody wants to do. Look at the mess, decide to be decisive, and cut the whole thing back hard to renovate it. On most shrubs, that is a renovation. On this one, it is not. And I will give you the honest verdict, because I would rather disappoint you than sell you hope. If your lavender is heavily woody, mostly bare, and split wide open through the middle, careful pruning may add a few more years. It is not going to give you back the plant you had. At some point, the right answer, and it is the one nobody wants to say out loud, is to take cuttings from the healthiest green tips you can find, root them, and start again with young plants. Lavender is not really a plant you inherit. It is a plant you keep renewing. Before I let you go, let me clear 4 things out of the way, because every one of them is going to come at you from somewhere this month. First, feeding a lavender after you cut it. The instinct is understandable. It looks like it could use a boost. Do not. Work from University of California Cooperative Extension on Mediterranean herbs is clear that excess nitrogen suppresses flowering significantly. What you get for your money is soft, floppy growth and fewer flowers. A lavender is not underfed. It evolved on poverty and performs best there. Second, watering an established plant on a schedule. What kills more lavender than any pest and any winter is wet feet. But let me add the exception: the short videos leave out, because leaving it out kills plants too. A lavender in its first year in the ground is not established, and it does need watering while it roots in. A lavender in a pot is never fully established, because a pot dries out. And in a genuine extended drought, even an old plant is better for the occasional deep soak. Dry as a way of life, not dry as a religion. Third, mulch. A thick, moisture-holding mulch packed up against that woody crown holds water in the one place the plant cannot tolerate it. If you mulch lavender at all, use gravel or grit, and keep it pulled back off the stems. Fourth, and this one is folklore, and I am labeling it as folklore rather than pretending otherwise. Cutting on a slant so water runs off the cut. A lovely old habit, and you will hear it everywhere. On a thin lavender stem, it is not doing what people say. Cut on a slant if it pleases you. It is harmless. It is simply not the reason your plant lives or dies. Now, 2 things before we finish, and the first one is a real question, not a formality. I want to hear about the cut you regret. Every one of us has one. The shrub we were decisive about. The plant we tidied up in the fall like a good gardener and then never saw flower again. Tell me what it was and what you would do differently, because somebody reading these comments this week is standing over that exact plant with the shears already open. And I will put an opinion of my own out there, and some of you are going to disagree, which is entirely fine. I think the advice you get at most garden centers, water it well after you prune, has the order backwards. If the point of the cut is to redirect sugar, the water needs to be in the plant before you ask, not after. That is my reasoning, and you can see it. If you have grown lavender for 30 years and your experience says otherwise, say so, and say why. I will read it. And if you learned this job from a parent or a grandparent, and their method was different from mine, that is the comment I want most of all. Some of the best gardening I have ever seen came out of hands that never read a single study. So, here is the whole thing in one breath. Your shears do not make new growth. Sugar makes new growth, and the cut only decides where it goes. Take the seed off, because seed is the biggest bill on the plant. Leave 2/3 of the green standing, because that green is the factory. Stay 2 inches above the wood, because the wood is a closed account. Do it inside 6 weeks of your own first frost date, whichever date that is. And remember that a share of everything that plant makes goes straight down into the ground to pay the crew that keeps it alive on poor soil. Which means the shears in your hand are a soil tool. That is the shift I wanted to hand you today. You are not tidying a plant. You are writing its budget for the year. So go out and put your hand into that lavender. Find where the green ends and the brown begins. Then look at how much green is standing above your fingers and decide, on purpose, how much of it you can afford to spend. Everything else follows from that. I will see you in the next one.